Hey there, it's Fran Davidson from Psychic and Energy Work, and this is a little video about past lives. Past life work is really interesting because, of course, to begin with, you've got to sort of believe that past life work can be real. It is real, and yet, of course, like anything else to do with the intuitive, energetic, or spiritual realms, it sort of comes back to what you've been exposed to, what you've experienced in life, your natural disposition towards such things, whether you listen to your intuition or not, and of course every other model that you may have been exposed to along the way. At the end of the day, I'd argue past life is very real, just like other forms of energy work. It can just pop in. All of a sudden it can have a life of its own, a story of its own, in a way that I'm not making this up, it's coming through. Why is it that past life work exists? Why is it that this realm is even possible to explore? At the end of the day, you could argue that we are each soul within a physical body, and that aspect of ourselves, that soul level aspect of ourselves, is connected to a greater collective of energy, whether we call that the universe, creation, cosmos, whatever your model is. Soul is that level of energy that is part of the cosmos, which is why, in a sense, intuitive work can happen. It's why spirit exists. There's so much more than the physical world that we know that seems to be so finite and time-bound in the day-to-day basis. It's because of this, it's because of the fact that the soul level aspect of an individual is actually part of a greater pool of energy. It's this that makes past life work a reality, past lives a reality. Simply because through time, soul is injected, if that's the way to say it, birthed into particular physical forms and lives. And so through time, soul journeys through various incarnations, lives, presentations of self, and they are all linked, not necessarily because they're all identical, not necessarily because they all have the same experiences, and yet this is where past life work becomes really interesting, and I'll touch on this a little bit more in a moment. Past life work can be performed perhaps in three ways, or perhaps from three angles. That might be the better way to say it. Firstly, very much from an entertainment or curiosity aspect, and there's nothing wrong with this. A lot can be uncovered even on an entertainment or curiosity basis that is actually of incredible help to a person here and now. Past life work, in a sense, done on a spiritual level, is very much about highlighting what dynamics are playing through this life at the moment that come from a previous life that often explain things, dynamics, dispositions that can't be explained this life. Why have I always been scared of swimming in the sea? Why have I always had an aversion to eating prawns? Those sorts of things. And it could be much more serious. It could also be much more light or from that similar direction. That's where past life work gets interesting, because invariably past life work can explain the unexplained, even down to relationship dynamics. Why is it that she and I, or he and I, just don't get on? We've never got on. There's always been something from the moment we met. We knew each other, and yet... And it could also be the other way around. Why is it that we're so attracted to one another? And of course, there can be many reasons for these things. So what I'm not trying to do is put everything or reduce everything down to a past life explanation, because that's just not the case. Anything in the real world or physical world can be explained from a number of angles, and just because something is happening, even if it's happening in the same way for two individuals, doesn't necessarily mean that it's happening from the same aspect. Past life, this world issues, spirit work, other dynamics. Another way to explore past life work is to go into a session with that very much as your intention. Sometimes we can do that because we ourselves have an inkling of, there's something past life about this. At other times, it may not be that, but it might be, I'm just struggling and I can't make a sense, and I want you as a practitioner to specifically focus in on this session just on past lives. And that's possible as well. The third way is where past life issues or explanations, dynamics, are all of a sudden presenting in a reading, but not because they've been asked for by the client or even sought by the practitioner. As I said before, any of these 3 levels of work can be incredibly productive, constructive, great fun, and also spiritually meaningful, helpful this life. This is also where it gets interesting, because past life work, I'd argue, comes with perhaps a couple of cautions. Sometimes we can approach past life experiences, issues, dynamics, or even the realm called past lives as a dynamic from the aspect of holding it like a photo album or a trophy cabinet. And I'd argue probably most of us do this when we start bumping into this area to begin with. Some continue to do that, not because I'm criticizing them. I'm just trying to point out that there are various ways to interface with this part of the world, and it doesn't necessarily require the holding of a past life as an explanation for this life, even though that is always the case. There is always some aspect of that plays through past life information. But the reason why I sort of raise it as a caution is that sometimes we can use what we learn of past lives as an excuse to stay where we're at with a dynamic that isn't as constructive as it could be. Sometimes we can shall we say, overly honour past life dynamics in a way that we keep them going this life, even though we understand that they're from a previous time. And so past life work, and this is also a caution by way of, shall we say, the practitioner's approach, because of course some practitioners can encourage a client through no fault of their own necessarily, to walk around with past life information in a way that it affects this life from an obstructing or a limiting perspective. You may know of somebody who perhaps, they met somebody and they were known to each other in a past life. And the way that they've learned about past lives, or the way that it was presented to them, was that perhaps they were here to reignite all that they experienced with this individual in a previous life and keep that going. Sometimes that's very definitely the case. At others, it's not. And so sometimes, with respect to the aspects of intuitive or spiritual work that are labelled things like twin flames or soulmates, people can be soulmates for sure, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're here to be in relationship with one another in the same way or closer this life. And so past life work is interesting because, again, sometimes we can use past life work as a trophy cabinet in a way that I keep a dynamic with me in a way that therefore is limiting or destructive, obstructive, repressing, limiting, when I don't actually have to. But because I don't necessarily understand that past life work done in a spiritual way, I'd argue, is here to explain things, but not to repeat the past in a way that keeps us bound to patterns that are limiting, constricting, repressive, etc. Past life work, it's interesting, I'd argue past life work that is truly spiritual liberates us from dynamics, be they this life and or past. One of the aspects of past life work is the fact that done on this level, it only ever presents, and I'd argue only ever really adds value, because it is explaining something of this current life that is currently perplexing or troublesome or challenging, for which the client doesn't quite have a full picture on. can't quite understand why that is happening. And again, so therefore past life work can often come out of situations where, hello, for all I know of this experience and this dynamic, this life, I just can't work out why it's happening. It's unexplainable if it's just left in a this life context. So you may be able to sense out of what I'm saying the value that past life work can derive. It can add meaning, and it can also explain things that are this life from a time that is not this life, in a way that puts the current life issues and dynamics that are troublesome, challenging, whatever those adjectives are, to bed. In a way that through knowing these things, we are then liberated from, you could say, our lack of awareness or our ignorance, not because they're negative words, but we're liberated from those states, and we are given enough information, understanding, and often even compassion to be able to deal with the current life situations more objectively, more holistically, and even more spiritually, in a way that gets us past the mental or egoic realms that just keep us bound in struggle or war or conflict or even limit again. So past life work can offer a lot of value. Does it happen every reading? No, doesn't need to. Again, there are a couple of ways you can approach past life work. You can specifically ask for it. But even in specifically asking for it, that doesn't necessarily mean that the issue or the dynamic that you're talking about is actually past life bound. And so this is also where it gets interesting, because depending on the filters through which an intuitive practitioner operates, they can of course approach everything from a past life perspective, and certainly they can find very meaningful and useful information in each and every case. Then you've also got practitioners who don't necessarily operate always through that perspective. They just tune in to the divine source, the universe, whatever your words are for that, to obtain whatever information they can that is spiritually inclined and therefore holistically bound, and therefore of the caliber that imparts maximum meaning to any question or issue that you might ask about. So past life work doesn't always present. Sometimes clients will ask for past life work on an issue specifically, and actually, you know what? It's not past life, it's actually something else. And I'd argue perhaps this is the best way to approach past lives, not necessarily because it's the only way that can add value or help a person, but because at the end of the day, we're here to live this life. And I'd argue past life work is only really meaningful and valuable when it is explaining things that help us this life, whether that's put things to bed, heal from an event that happened previously, explain a limitation, a blockage, a dynamic that seems to be obstructing flow currently, or whether it's even challenging a perception about the future that is limited and therefore blocking our ability to tap into our potential as it exists this life, and as this life exists as the first step to next lives, and therefore as an arena where we can cancel out, we can heal, we can learn and evolve from past life issues just as we do current issues in a way that optimizes everything that comes next. So I hope I've explained a little bit about past lives from my perspective, from a psychic and energy work perspectives. I hope that it makes sense, and certainly if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. All the very best for you. Thank you very much for tuning in to this video about past lives. Take good care and speak to you soon.